Good afternoon once again, my GMT20240730 students. We are now nearing the finish line. So I got two short chapters to complete this course. This next chapter that we're going to be talking about is chapter 32, which is a chapter on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is basically the baseline model that macroeconomists use to analyze economic fluctuations. Why we go into recessions, why we go into economic expansions, how the economy is growing, you know what I mean? So we're going to be talking about things that drive business cycles. This idea that the economy goes through upturns and downturns, because economy, like the United States economy does not grow in a straight line, that you're going to expect the economy to grow all the time. No, sometimes we fall in a recession. Sometimes we go through an expansionary phase when things are going well for us. When things are going well for us, the economy produces a large amount of goods and services, like GDP is up, employment growth is up. We love that scenario, okay? But once things are turned against us, we go through what we call recessions, right? And recessions are characterized by falling output, falling GDP growth, and falling employment. So unemployment tends to be very high during recessionary cycles. So the goal of this chapter is basically to show you what drives this business cycle. So we're going to be talking about some like aggregate demand shocks and aggregate supply shocks. Okay, so let me share my screen, then we'll discuss it on the other side. Okay, so you can see the chapter there is business fluctuations, aggregate demand, and aggregate supply. So here's going to be the outline of this chapter. We're going to talk about a curve called aggregate demand curve. In the microeconomic chapters that we talked about, because remember, this course combines both micro and macro, we talked about a chapter on demand and supply. But when we are talking about demand and supply in that chapter, the earlier chapters, we're talking about it in respect to one particular good. Like say the demand for gasoline, the supply of gasoline, the demand for say iPhones, the supply for iPhones. So when you're talking about the demand and supply for one particular good or just one industry, that is microeconomics. Here in macroeconomics, the word aggregate means total. So aggregate demand is the same thing, synonymous to saying what? Total demand curve. So while we talked about demand for a single product, in macroeconomics, we're going to talk about the total demand for all goods and services in an economy. Okay? And then we shall also talk about the supply side of the market. We're going to distinguish between what we call short-run and long-run aggregate supply curve. And we shall talk about what we call real shocks in the economy, like shocks to aggregate supply, for example, like technology shocks, when weather-related shocks, like anything that affect the supply side of the economy will be viewed as real supply shocks, But most likely, we're going to be talking about aggregate demand shocks and the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, and then we shall talk about shocks to components of aggregate demand. And then we're going to wrap it up by talking about like the case study, understanding the Great Depression. Okay, the Great Depression happened in 1929 through 1933 when Herbert Hoover was president. So we can see, we're going to talk about how aggregate demand shocks and real shocks played a role in amplifying that great economic downturn, which we became known as a Great Depression. And then, of course, we're going to talk about all the some takeaways. So economic growth is not a smooth process, as I already alluded to in my earlier remarks. The economy doesn't grow, in a straight line, that things are always rosy all the time. No way. They think that's not the reality. So for example, the real GDP in the United States has grown at an average of 3.2% per year over the past 65 years. So that is remarkable. But the economy rarely grew at an average rate, though. Sometimes there are swings. Some years we get negative growth when we get in a recession. Sometimes we get opposite growth. Again, for example, growth rate fluctuated between -5% and more than 8% sometimes. And then recessions are of special concern to policymakers, both policymakers in Congress and the Federal Reserve, okay, and the public, because unemployment typically increases during recessions. So anytime an economy is hit by recession, any policymaker out there, be it the Congress or policymakers in Congress or policymakers at the Federal Reserve, they're always very concerned. They're going to try to put in policies to try to kind of like tame down, the severity of the recession, make sure that, we get rid of the recession, get rid of unemployment. So let's discuss a little bit about business cycle, business fluctuations, basically fluctuations in growth rate of real GDP along its trend. We talked about this topic a little bit before in the earlier chapter. So the idea here is that the economy, let me just reiterate this a little bit before we go further, because I know we talked about it in the previous chapter on economic growth, which we did. I think that was chapter 27, if I may recall. Yeah, you'll check it on your whatever. So, but anyway, on your slides. So business cycles. So when we're talking about business cycles, this is basically this alternating periods of economic downturns. Economic downturn, that's what we are calling recessions. And economic upturns. Which you can call them what? Expansion, when the economy is expanding, is growing. Okay. So of course, that's going to be, that alternating periods are going to be along somewhat, around some long run trend. Okay. So a typical business cycle is going to look like this. Let me draw the picture here for you in a sec. A typical business cycle look like this. If we put GDP growth on this axis, and then we put here time, the economy does not grow on the straight line. This straight line is what we call the long run trend. The economy rather meanders, like the economy grows like that, as we talked about. So when we are falling, that is what we call recession. That is downturns. And then this side of the semi-cycle, that's upturns, expansion when the economy is growing. When the economy is falling in a recession, the lowest point that the economy can hit, that the economy can fall before you start growing again, is what we call the trough. The trough. And then when the economy is expanding, the highest point that the economy can reach on that expansion before we start falling again is what we call a peak. So we talked about these key features of a recession in the earlier chapters. So the goal of this chapter is trying to understand this a little bit in depth, that what brings these economic fluctuations, which we're calling business cycle fluctuations, is going to be due to like some aggregate demand shocks and some real shocks to the economy. Okay. For example, if the consumer stops spending money, we know the United States economy is a consumer-driven economy, all right? Then that could send the economy to a recession. If consumers and businesses lack confidence, they have fears in the economy, they're going to stop spending money, and that could throw the economy in a recession. Or if the stock market crashes, people lose wealth on Wall Street, households are not going to spend a lot of money when they're losing money on their investments on Wall Street. Okay, so a decrease in household wealth is going to throw the economy in a recession sometimes. Okay, and then shocks can also emanate from the supply side of the economy. For example, oil price shocks. When oil is a very important source of energy. We need oil for production of many other things. So if oil prices are rising, then that means the cost of producing goods will go up. So that would be a real shock, real supply shock. Or we could also have like technology shocks. We invent, we come up with a better technology, like now the artificial intelligence, data science, all these things, these are new technologies that allow us to produce more goods and services that could boost production. So anyway, so that's what business cycle is about. So a recession is a significant widespread decline in real income and employment. In a recession, we know people are losing jobs. So employment declines, that means high unemployment, because unemployment is the opposite of employment. So employment is rising during a recession, that means employment is falling in a recession, that means unemployment is rising. People lose jobs. That's the reason why there's a decrease in real income. So real GDP is going to fall as well. So here's the kind of like a US business cycle going back to the late 1940s to the 2007-2009 recession. I did not include if you extend this graph to the right this way, I've not included the COVID, the pandemic recession of 2020. But you can see these pole-looking bars that you see on this graph, those are times when America experienced economic recession, okay? The recession that we experienced before COVID, that was, as I say, 2007, 2009 recession. You can see that at any time on those pole-looking bars, the growth rate of the economy falls, because that's a typical characteristic of a recession. So the way you're seeing this movement like up and down is the same thing that I drew here. Business cycle, economy is always up and down. So during recession, you can see clearly here, any recession, pick any bar, economy, you see growing negatively, see? Growth rate falls, see? And we saw that already earlier on. The definition of a recession is that when you have economies hit by 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. When GDP growth declines for 6 months, those are 2 consecutive quarters, okay? Then we say that the economy has entered a recession. In fact, the government bureau, the federal bureau that is in charge announcing to Americans whether the recession has started or whether it has ended, which is called the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, they always wait at least 6 months. And then they will announce to Americans that, oh, the recession has started, but it started 6 months, ago. Why? Because they need to observe whether if GDP falls for 2 months and start growing, and economy start growing again, that's not a recession. It has to be at least 6 consecutive months or 2 consecutive quarters in a year for it to be called a recession. So you can see this is U.S. civilian unemployment. Unemployment always rises. So see, during these periods where these pole-looking lines, these are periods when we have had economic downturn, economic recession. You can see along those pole-looking lines, unemployment rises, which is a typical characteristic of a recession, And then in between any 2 pole-looking bars, like these white portions in this graph, those are the 8 times when the economy is what? The economy would be growing. Economy would be on an upturn or expansion or recovery. So when the economy is on an expansionary phase of the business cycle, real GDP would be rising, unemployment falls. So unemployment is a counter-cyclical economic variable. It moves counter to the general, opposite to the trends in general economic activity. When the economy is falling, in a recession, unemployment rises. When the economy is growing, unemployment falls. So unemployment is counter-cyclical. But most macroeconomic variables are pro-cyclical. Pro-cyclical means they move with what? Trends in general economic activity. Let me kind of like write that down for you so that you get to know what I'm talking about here. Hit this thing to do like one by one. So we're saying that unemployment is a counter-cyclical variable. Counter-cyclical variable. That basically means it moves in opposite direction. It moves in opposite direction with the general trend in economic activity. But as I said, most macro variables, including GDP, employment, prices, inflation, interest rates, consumption, investment, they tend to, so most macro variables, macroeconomic variables, tend to be procyclical. Procyclical means they move in the same direction with the trends in general economic activity. For example, when the economy is doing well, when the economy is growing, employment is rising as well. GDP is rising as well. Interest rates tend to rise when the economy is doing well. Inflation rises with recession, with economic expansion, the economy is doing well. Consumption tend to rise. Consumers spend more money when the economy is in good times. Business tend to invest more money when the economy is doing well. So you can see most macroeconomic variables that we care about tend to move in the same direction with the trends in general economic activity. So they are pro-cyclical macroeconomic variables. So unemployment is perhaps one of those variables that is what? Weird. It moves in opposite direction with the trend in general economic activity. So that's what we call it a counter-cyclical variable. Counter means you're moving in opposite direction. Okay, so now let's talk about that. So in this chapter now, we're going to understand booms and recessions. Booms mean expansion when the economy is growing. Recessions means we are falling. So we will develop a model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply with three curves. So we're going to start with developing what the aggregate demand curve is. And again, I need to warn you again, this aggregate demand means total demand for goods and services in the economy. It's not a demand for a single good. It's not a demand for gasoline. It's not a demand for baby cereal. It's not a demand for a car. This is a demand for all goods and services in the economy. The word aggregate means total. So it's a macroeconomic topic because in macro, we care about everything happening in the economy, not just one thing. And then we shall talk about aggregate, long-run aggregate supply curve. And so aggregate supply is going to be total supply of goods and services, which is basically just GDP. Because the total supply of all goods and services in the economy, market value of all goods is GDP. So we're going to distinguish between aggregate supply into two, short-run and long-run aggregate supply curve. So I'll show you what long-run aggregate supply curve is and short-run aggregate supply curve is. And then we're going to use the aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve model to show how unexpected economic disturbance or shocks can temporarily increase or decrease the rate of growth in the economy, growth in GDP. Okay, so in the previous chapter, which is the chapter that we talked about, the chapter on inflation and the quantity theory of money, we talked about, velocity, money supply, real GDP, and we talked about what? The price level, okay? So in fact, we said M times V, you know this formula here equals to P times YR. So this is like real what? Real output, then this is price. So this relationship is what we call the quantity theory. So the aggregate demand curve is going to show all the combinations of inflation and real growth that are consistent with a specific rate of spending growth. Okay. So let me define that again. Aggregate demand curve shows all combinations of inflation and real growth that are consistent with a specific rate of spending growth. Okay. So spending growth is going to come from the what okay, so this equation M times V, first of all, equals to Y P times YR. You can express this equation in growth rate. In growth rate, because these are in level, this is level of money supply, velocity, price level, and what? Real output, okay, or real GDP. This equation, if you express this equation in growth rate, it can be written as a percentage change in money supply. The word, this is a percentage sign. Delta means change. Percentage change in M plus percentage change in velocity must equal to percentage change in price plus percentage change in what? In real GDP. So the percentage change in money supply, we can write this as M with an arrow pointing this way. So that means this is a growth rate in money supply plus a growth rate in velocity, which we can write this way with an arrow pointing that way. So that must equal to the growth rate in price level, we can write like that, plus a growth rate in real what? Real output or real GDP, which you can write like that. Okay. But it turns out that, so this is exactly what I'm talking about. So this quantity theory is not written in terms of growth rate. So this model is saying that the growth rate of money supply plus a growth rate of velocity, we talked about velocity in the previous chapter, is the average number of times that each dollar bill is spent. Okay, must equal the price growth rate in the price level. But the growth rate in the price level, this guy here, that is inflation, because inflation is defined as the percentage increase in the general price level. So the growth rate in the price level is the same thing as a percentage increase in the what? In the price level. Okay, so that's inflation. And then this is a growth rate of real GDP. So the aggregate demand curve, as I said, basically gonna be shows all combination of inflation and real growth that are consistent with a specified rate of spending growth. That's right. So that means when we're drawing the aggregate demand curve, inflation is gonna go on the what? On a vertical axis. And then the growth rate in real GDP is gonna go on the horizontal axis. Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit here. So we can also write the equation as follows. I talked about this equation here because we know P stands for inflation. Okay. So we can write this equation as M plus V, growth rate in M plus growth in velocity must equal to inflation plus real growth. So real growth, that's basically growth rate in what this variable in real GDP. So we're just rewriting it to basically acknowledging that the percentage change in the price level is nothing but inflation. Okay. So now we can do some simple whatever. So if the money supply is growing at 5%, for example, if you let this guy grow at 5%, and velocity is growing at 0, so this is 0, so plus 0. And the real growth rate is 0%, so the economy is growing at 0%. Then that means we can solve for inflation. Because if this is 0, this is 0, that means inflation would be 5% as well. Okay. In other words, if the money supply is growing and velocity is constant, when velocity is constant, that's the reason why the growth rate in velocity is 0. When something does not change, that means the growth rate or the percentage change of something that doesn't change is 0. So if velocity is constant, the growth rate in velocity is going to be 0. And if GDP is constant, the growth rate in real GDP is going to be 0. So that means the growth rate in money supply will be equivalent to the what? To inflation. If the Federal Reserve increases the money supply by 5%, like it's being suggested here, and velocity is constant, GDP is constant, then prices are going to increase by 5%. In other words, inflation is going to go up 5%. Another example, if the money growth is 5% and velocity is 0, and the economy grows at 3%, then inflation is 2%. So all you got to do is substitute in that formula. You go back here. So in this case, we're saying that if this thing is still growing at 5%, and then this thing is still 0, and then we want to solve for inflation, but now we have been told that the economy this guy is growing at 3%. So the only unknown to solve inflation, so you subtract 3% from both sides. That means inflation is going to be 2%. So that's what I mean here. Inflation will be 2%. So an aggregate demand curve tells us all the combinations of inflation and real growth that are consistent with a specified rate of spending. And so when you say spending comes from where? Spending is going to come from what? When we use money to buy goods and services. So the growth rate in money supply in the economy is going to signify the growth rate of spending and velocity, because velocity shows the what? the average number of times that each dollar bill is being spent. Okay, so if people are spending more money more quickly, that means the rate of spending is going up. So both M and V are going to represent what? Spending in the economy, spending growth. So in our example, any combination of inflation and real growth that adds up to 5% is on the same aggregate demand curve. So we're going to talk about this. See that? So any combination, for example, combination of what? So the aggregate demand curve is going to slope downwards. We plot combination of inflation on the horizontal axis and real GDP growth rate on the vertical axis, inflation, and horizontal axis what? Real GDP growth. So any combination of inflation and real GDP growth that add to 5% in this case means that that point is going to be located on that demand curve or aggregate demand curve, like combination of 5% growth in real GDP and what, and 0% growth in what, in real GDP, or combination of 2% inflation, which we did solving a problem, and what, 3% growth rate in real GDP. You end up at point B on the what, on the demand curve. So this curve, the aggregate demand curve, shows a negative correlation between inflation and real GDP growth. Okay, when inflation is rising in the economy, okay, the growth rate in GDP falls. When inflation is falling in the economy, like say from 5 to 2%, then real GDP is going to increase. I'm going to talk about the reason why that is the case shortly. And then, and then if the slope of this aggregate demand curve, right now, the slope of this aggregate demand curve could be what? That's like 5%, right? So the negative 1%, because negative is slope. That means a 1 percentage point increase in real growth reduces inflation by 1%. That's right. So I just want to put in your mind that there's always a negative relationship between inflation and real GDP. When the economy is growing, that means we're producing more output, more GDP, more supply of goods and services. Prices of goods tend to fall, meaning inflation is going to fall. If the economy does not produce enough output, let's say real GDP growth is falling, that means negative growth. That means the economy has not produced enough output. Then the prices of those goods that are few will go up. Think about it for a second. If we live in a small town where there's only one supermarket, and let's say we all go, let's say there's 500,000 people who live in that small town, and one day we will go to the supermarket, we all want to buy bread, and there are only 10 loaves of bread available on the shelf. What do you think the price of that bread is going to be? Of course, it's going to be very high. That means we'll produce less bread. GDP growth is low. So that's going to result into inflation. So now, fundamentally, you're going to learn that inflation, which we talked about in the previous chapter, we say that inflation is mostly due to the central bank printing money. You're going to learn another thing today, that what inflation may also be due to low productivity. When the economy is not growing, we're not producing enough output. That may also bring inflation, even though the Federal Reserve may not have even increased the money supply. Okay? If we don't have enough output, enough goods and services produced in the economy, the price in the economy are going to go up. So that's a no-brainer. You guys know this. Limited supply, like, during COVID, since COVID up to today, our economy has been experiencing supply chain problems. Supply chain has prompted companies who are not getting their raw material goods on time. So part of that supply chain issues resulted into slower growth in production. So you cannot say that all the inflation that we have today was due to the spending, from spending when we bail out the economy from COVID. Of course, that's one side of the story. The other side of the story, that supply chain issues have also contributed to this inflation that we experience up to today. Okay, when companies don't get raw material goods on time, then the few raw material goods that they may get, the price are going to go up. That's going to translate into higher cost of production. And then they will pass that burden of higher cost of production to the consumers in terms of higher pricing. Okay, so the inflation is not only a monetary phenomenon like Milton Friedman was suggesting. but it could also be due to a low productivity issue. Okay. So the growth rate in money supply plus the growth rate in velocity equals to inflation and what? And real growth. We talked about that already. Because, remember, M growth plus V growth was equals to inflation, which is written as P plus what? Real growth, which is YR growth. This is what we call real what? Real growth. So the answer is C. Okay. So let's talk about shifting the aggregate demand curve. Okay. So increase in spending must flow into either a higher inflation rate or a higher growth rate. If spending growth rate increases, okay, because of either an increase. Okay, so now you ask me what will trigger Americans to spend more money? We spend more money when we have more money. You know what I mean? So, and when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, that's going to make it easier for Americans to acquire that money. What do you think is going to happen? That's going to trigger more spending in the economy. And that more spending, it can either contribute to inflation or it could contribute to growth in what? In GDP. Okay? Or if there's an increase in velocity, if Americans choose to start spending money more rapidly, because velocity is the rate at which a dollar bill is what? Exchanges hands. If we're exchanging money more rapidly, that means Americans have decided to start spending money more rapidly in the economy. That is going to drive up spending as well. That could contribute to inflation. So a decrease in spending growth will shift the aggregate demand curve inwards, but an increase in spending is going to shift to the right. So here's what I'm talking about here. What I'm saying here is that if you increase spending, and spending can come from either the Fed increasing the money supply. Now there's a lot of money in the economy, that's going to trigger more spending. That's the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right, from the blue line to the red line. Okay, so this can potentially increase inflation to from 5% to 7%. If we assume that what? That GDP does not grow. Okay. But you could think about it here also too. If that spending change contributed to the growth rate in the economy, okay, let's say we're starting from this point, we can move this way as well, where we're increasing growth rate from 3 to 5%. Okay, so you still have everything still add to it. So it's going to be, so the new aggregate demand curve, it means that there's going to be a new combination when we add inflation rate and real growth is not going to add to 7% at any point on that rate, on that red line. Because you pick this point here, that means we're adding 2% growth rate in inflation and 5% growth rate on real growth, real GDP growth rate. That adds to 7%. Or if you pick this point on the new demand curve, that we're talking about 7% inflation and 0% growth rate in real GDP. So that adds to 7%. Okay, so you're going to get a new combination of real output growth and inflation rate, which add to 7%. The previous demand curve, those combination of inflation rate and real GDP growth rate added to only 5%, like this point here. It's like 5 plus 0, you get 5%. 2 plus 3% add to 5%. But now they add to 7 on the new line. So an increase in spending growth, and spending growth can be triggered by when the Fed prints money, or it could be triggered by increase in velocity, growth rate in velocity. If Americans start to exchange the dollar more rapidly in the economy, that means we are spending more money. So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. And then the converse of that is true. If the Federal Reserve decides to decrease the growth rate in the money supply, so there's going to be limited money available in the economy, or when Americans slow down their spending patterns, velocity goes down, then the aggregate demand curve is going to shift inwards. It shifts to the left. It will shift to somewhere like something like this, to the left. Okay, so decrease in spending growth, which is triggered by either a decrease in money supply growth or a decrease in velocity growth, growth rate, percentage change in velocity is decreasing, then that's going to shift the AD curve, aggregate demand curve to the left. Okay. So later on, I'm going to be distinct because right now we're just talking about increases in spending growth. So we can talk about who's spending that money. So this spending can come from American households, what we call consumer spending, consumption spending, or it can come from businesses, what we call business investment spending, or it could come from government. Government also buys goods and services, government purchases. Or it could even come from foreigners. Foreigners also spend money on our goods. The net foreign sector, we export our goods to foreign countries. Okay? So that spending growth can come from either household, American families spending money, or it can come from businesses spending money, or it could come from US government spending money, or it could come from foreigners who are trying to buy our goods, because we sell our goods to foreign countries as well, what we call exports. Exports are foreign spending on domestic goods. Okay? So later you could, for example, if I say, suppose there's an increase in consumer spending, and you can ask yourself, what could make Americans spend more money? Right now, we're talking about just maybe there's an increase in money supply, but there could be a lot more other things that could make Americans spend money. Maybe Americans consumers, there's a boost in consumer confidence. Or it could be maybe the consumer wealth, household wealth is growing. Maybe if the stock market booms or the housing market start booming, Americans gain wealth in real estate. They also gain wealth on Wall Street. Okay, so that could boost their spending. The other thing could be businesses. When businesses are more optimistic about the economy, somebody tells American businesses that the economy is headed to the right direction. Economy is going to do well. They're going to spend more money. Okay, so we'll discuss those when we chopped out. We kind of like disentangle those components of spending growth, which could come from consumers, could come from businesses, could come from government and foreign sector. But before I talked about that, let's jump and talk about the long run aggregate supply. Okay, so every economy, whether it's the UK economy, whether it's the United States economy, whether the Chinese economy or Canada or Australia, every economy has got what we call a potential growth rate determined by, so potential means that if the economy has already exhausted all its available factors of production, and factors of production are going to be things like capital, labor, technology. Let's say if America has already exhausted all its available technology, we're using our technology to our full capacity, and we have exhausted our labor. If everybody's working full time, and we have maxed out our capital, our production plants are being operated at full capacity utilization of our production plants. There are no slacks in capacity. Then the maximum, the output that we end up producing is what we call potential output. Okay? So that potential output that we produce means you have fully exhausted your stock of labor, capital, and you have increased technology. This technology has come because of, in productivity is going to come from technology. That means you maxed out your technology. So the rate of growth as given by these real factors of production is what we call the solo growth rate. Meaning that the solo growth rate, anything that changes the quantity of labor and capital or productivity, when we get better technology like AI, artificial intelligence, technology makes labor more productive. It raises productivity. Those are the only thing that is going to increase this solo growth rate, but not printing money. Okay, it has to be real things. So government spending, whether you spend all the money you want, if the economy is productive, these inputs to produce labor, capital, and productivity have already been maxed out, printing money will have zero effect on this solo growth. The only thing that will increase that solo growth is going to be when you change the quantity of labor, capital, and productivity or technology. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line at the solo growth rate, independent of inflation. So this is how we're going to draw the line. So this long-run aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic, it's vertical. Okay? See, so it's independent of inflation, meaning that what? Remember our notation for inflation is pi. Why do I say it's independent of inflation? Okay, if you have like inflation, level of inflation at pi 1, that could be maybe 2%. The level of the solo growth rate is going to be here. If inflation increases to a higher level like pi 2, guess what? That does not affect that solo growth rate. That's why we're saying that the long-run aggregate supply curve or the solo growth rate is independent of inflation rate, meaning that changes in inflation have zero effect on the long-run aggregate supply curve. The only thing that will shift this long-run aggregate supply curve to the right or to the left are those three things that I talked about. For example, if the economy discovers or builds more capital, if the economy adds more labor, maybe train more work, American workers become more skilled. Those are the things that can shift this curve to the right. Or if the economy discovers new technologies that boost labor productivity, that will shift this curve to the right. Okay. So the solo growth rate is an economist's potential growth rate, the rate of economic growth that would occur given flexible price and existing real factors of production. Okay. So the long run aggregate supply curve, which is abbreviated as LRAS, that is the acronym for it, is the vertical line at the solo growth rate. I already don't talk about that. So here's your self-check here. So an economist's potential growth rate is called the solo growth rate. We just talked about that. So when do we shift that vertical line? I talked about it. You can only shift that line to the left or to the right. You can, okay, so let's say there's a natural disaster. Natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, fires, right? Now, these wildfires. What do they do? What do those natural disasters do? They destroy capital. They destroy people. They kill people. So natural disasters can reduce the number of workers in the economy. If it's a big natural disaster, like the tsunami that happened in Japan a couple of years ago, killed so many people in Japan, destroyed so much capital in Japan. Those are the things that can shift that vertical line to the left. But otherwise, if we build more capital instead, or we increase the number of workers in the economy, we boost technology, that increases labor productivity, then that line is going to shift to the right. Okay. Okay, but before we talked about shifts in that, when we put the aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply curve together, because no, economy reaches equilibrium when aggregate demand intersects what? When demands intersect with supply. That's a concept of equilibrium. So when we put aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve together like that, aggregate demand curve and long-run aggregate supply curve, we can then say, because we know that the aggregate demand curve is determined by the growth rate in spending, which is driven by money supply growth and growth in velocity. Okay? So we're saying that, let's assume that the long-run aggregate supply curve, the solo growth rate, economy is growing at what? 3%. Okay? But inflation is 7%. That means at this point of equilibrium on the demand curve, if you add the inflation rate and the growth rate in real GDP, or the solo growth rate, that adds to 10%. Okay, so total spending would be equals to what? Spending growth would be 10%. Okay. So shifting the long-run aggregate supply curves, economies are continually hit by real shocks. Which shifts so when I talk about real shocks, I'm talking about shocks to what? Things, real factors, not money, not spending. Real shocks are going to be things like technology. They're going to be things like changes in capital stock, changes in labor resources. Okay. So this in turn is, those are the things that are going to solve. For example, possible shocks can include wars, because wars can destroy capital. We have a major world war, like World War I and II. What happened? We destroyed our bridges, we destroyed capital, people got killed. So number of workers in the economy are going to reduce because of wars. That's a real shock to the economy. Weather-related shocks that I talked about. When you have like drought, that if they say your economy, if you're talking about some developing economy that is so much dependent on agricultural activity. Agricultural activity is, agricultural productivity rests on weather. If you have good weather, more rainfall, ideal weather for those agricultural whatever, those crops and whatever, then you boost agricultural productivity. But if you have like drought and other bad weather related shocks, then you're going to reduce output. There could also be major new regulations can affect production. Like the EPA, the Environmental Policy Agency, always comes up with what? Because they need to protect the environment, which we all agree. But the EPA sometimes might say, well, they may come up with emission standards, very stringent emission standards for car companies, for the auto industry to follow, saying that all the cars you're producing must meet these emission standards. Okay, but that means that could affect the way car companies produce cars. It could affect the number of cars that can be produced. So it could shift the supply curve to the left. Tax rate changes. Taxes can be a disincentive to investment. And investment always translates into capital stock. Mass strikes. When people strike, especially countries in Europe, which are a lot of countries in Europe depend so much on labor unions. And sometimes labor union workers can lay down their, they may refuse to go to work because they want better benefits. Okay. So when nobody shows up at work, that means output is going to fall. We are not terrorist attacks like we had here 9/11. Okay. And then new technologies. So these are some of the shocks I'm talking about. These are real shocks. They're not like spending. Wars are going to destroy capital, they're going to destroy people. Okay. Weather shocks are going to destroy people. Bad weather, like flooding and stuff like that. It can affect agricultural production, major new regulations, all those kind of stuff. So here's what is going to happen. When you have a positive shock, a positive real shock means that those shocks are favorable to production. So they're going to be, for example, you don't have, if economy does not experience any war, you get like better weather conditions, you get maybe better technology, you discover new technologies. Those are going to be interpreted as positive shock. They will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And that means if you shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, it means the economy is going to grow at a faster rate. At what? We're now at a new long-run aggregate supply curve. The economy grows at 7% instead of 3%. But if you have negative shocks to the economy, and then by the way, because you are producing more output because of that positive real shock, that is going to have an effect on inflation. Inflation is going to fall from 7% because yes, this is where we were before the shock happened. When the shock happened, this line shifts to the right like that. So the new equilibrium between aggregate demand and aggregate long run is going to be at this point. So inflation is going to fall from what? 3%. And the reason why inflation falls, if the economy is producing more output, more supply means prices need to come down. And then the converse is true. If the economy is hit by a negative shock, negative real shock, those could be like wars, natural disasters, bad weather, negative technologies, stringent environmental policy regulation by the EPA, those kind of stuff. Those things are going to negatively affect how much we produce. So the long-run supply curve is going to shift to the left. You see, the economy could experience negative growth because it was growing and the solo growth was at 3%. Now it could drop to negative 1%. And if you're reducing the growth rate of the economy, is not growing, it's growing negatively, that has got implication on inflation because we have not produced enough. So prices are going to rise instead to 11%. See? Okay, so that's how you can think about all those real shocks will shift. So let's talk about the case of India here. For a long period of time, the Indian economy has always relied on agricultural sector. So agriculture has always been a major, one of the largest contributing force to India's GDP, to India's national output. But if farmers in India are struggling, maybe because of bad weather, many other sectors are going to suffer. Because agricultural output, if it's the biggest output in GDP, is connected to other sectors of the economy. Agricultural sector can be connected to manufacturing sector. It can be connected to a whole host of other sectors. Okay? So if agricultural sector suffers, that shock in agricultural sector can send shock waves to the entire economy. Other sectors of the economy that are related to agriculture will get affected. For example, the fertilizer industry. If agriculture is shrinking, that means farmers are not demanding enough fertilizer. So fertilizer industry is going to be affected. Okay? So agriculture is going to, and other light processing industries, because there are farms that process agricultural goods, into a level that can be, reach the consumer for final consumption. So if agricultural sector is you don't get enough farm output, that is going to trigger, tremendous shocks to other sectors of the economy. So weather shocks influence both agricultural output and GDP then. So as the Indian economy has grown and diversified, shocks due to weather become less economically important because over time, India carried out several reforms. They started building other industries. So they diversified their economy away from relying on agricultural sector because that was risky. So that nowadays, agriculture is not the main dominant force to the Indian economy. But many years ago, like 50 years ago, 30, 20 years ago, it was a dominant force in India's GDP. But because of India's diversified away to other sectors like manufacturers and others, high-tech sectors, that means that, shocks to agriculture no longer pose a bigger threat to the Indian economy like it used to. Yeah, so this panel that I'm telling you, this is exactly what I'm telling you, what would happen in the Indian economy. So this, any growth in it, if you see the blue line there, that is deviation of rainfall from average, because agricultural output relies so much on what? On rainfall. You can see that when rainfall falls, agricultural output falls as well. And so that means because agriculture is a dominant sector in the Indian economy, that means you could actually argue that rainfall shock is also correlated with the overall GDP growth rate of the Indian economy. So if rainfall falls, the national output of GDP growth is going to fall as well because agriculture is contributing too much in that real GDP growth. So that's how real shocks like weather shocks can affect the entire economy, not only one sector. Oil. Oil is a very important input that we use in manufacturing sector. Yes, oil is a key source of energy. You know that. So in an economy with a large manufacturing sector, a reduction in oil supply is going to reduce GDP. Because if we reduce the supply of oil, like, that means the price of oil is going to go up a lot. That's not good for companies that are operating manufacturing plants that rely on oil as an input to producing goods or as a source of energy. So oil and machines are complementary. They work together with labor to produce output. When the oil supply is reduced, capital and labor become less productive. So the first OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, we talked about this, oil shock, came in the late 1973 when OPEC decided to decrease the global supply of oil. OPEC is this global oil cartel, okay? Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran and others, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, Nigeria are part of this OPEC. So sometimes they collude and meet, and then they just decide to decrease the global supply of oil. So they did that in the 1970s. Can you believe that the global oil price increased from $7 a barrel to about $38 a barrel? That's a big shock. And then that affected global manufacturing, even here in the United States. Because back in the days in the 1970s, America used to rely so much on oil coming from the Persian Gulf. Okay, we were not a major oil producing nation back in the 1970s. But if you ask me now, the United States, as I speak today, is the largest oil producing nation. We produce more oil than Saudi Arabia. But in the 1970s, we were not. Okay, we were heavily reliant on foreign oil coming from the Persian Gulf. That means if those countries like Saudi Arabia would decide to decrease the global supply of oil, American manufacturing industries would be affected because that would drive up the what? The entire global oil price. So since oil is an important input in many sectors, high oil price or oil shocks had many American industries. In each of the last 6 US recessions, there was a large increase in oil price just prior to or coincident with the onset of recession. So global oil price shocks can contribute to US business side. There's research that have been done by economists working in this topic who have shown that, oil price shocks affect GDP growth. For example, a 10% increase in the price of oil lowers GDP growth rate for a little more than 2 years. That's tremendous. Okay. So I talk about that. You can see that one of the reasons in the 1970s was not a good time for America because you can see that also, we had the Iranian Revolution in 1978, 1979. Iran was a major player in the what? In the oil market. In fact, our relationship with Iran started getting strained in 1979 when a student-led revolution, they ended up, they stormed a U.S. embassy in Tehran and kidnapped American diplomats. Okay, so because of the revolution that was going on in Iran, the relationship started getting strained in 1979. Okay, so we started putting sanctions where we don't trade with Iran. Iran used to supply us with their oil before that relationship strained. So now when we take Iran out, that means, the global supply of oil to the United States also fell. So that contributed a lot to the US, that oil price increase in America. Okay. And you can clearly see that periods when oil prices rise, like here, 1973, that corresponded to US recession. Look at this other recession, because recession are those pole-looking bars. You can see that US recessions have always been preceded by increase in oil prices. You can see that. See here, big jump in oil price, then there's a recession of 2000. You see? So oil is a major contributor to recessions. Oil price increases. So here's a small summary of it, of what negative shocks or negative real shocks and positive real shocks. I already talked about it. Bad weather, like important in a natural economy, that's going to shift the long run supply curve to the left. But if it's good weather, it should say what? The long run supply curve to the right. Higher price of oil or another important input will shift the what? The long run supply curve to the left. But lower price of oil, that means cost of production will be low. Good for production. So the long run supply curve will shift to the right. Productivity slump due to technology slump. Okay, will shift the curve to the left. But when you have a productivity boom due to technology, because technology is what raises productivity, or you have higher taxes or regulation, that affects how we build capital. So that shifts the long run supply curve to the left, but lower taxes or less regulation will shift that curve to the right. Disruption of production by war, earthquake, or pandemic will shift the long run supply curve to the left, but smooth production without disruption. So you get to know the real factors that will affect that long run aggregate supply curve. So it's a little self-check. Higher business taxes will shift the long run supply curve to there. We talked about that. That's to the left. It will decrease the long run supply curve shifting into the left. So let's talk about aggregate demand shocks. Okay. So it turns out that there are two types of economies who disagree philosophically. So the economists that I've just discussed here, economists who believe that GDP is affected by real shocks. Those economists are called classical economists. Okay, these economists who believe whatever we discuss here, they believe that fluctuations in GDP mainly come from the supply side of the economy, supply side effects. Then there come these British economists that you guys might have heard about. So Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes wrote his textbook, the book that changed the philosophical views in macroeconomics. Before John Maynard Keynes wrote his book, the mainstream economic thinking or philosophy was under the classical theory. So it was classical school of thought. You can call it classical theory. So classical economic theory is the idea that economies always self-regulate itself. When the economy goes to a recession, government should not intervene. Okay? The economy is going to self-correct itself. Okay? Prices of goods and price of labor are flexible. They adjust almost instantaneously to clear any disequilibrium that may exist in markets. Okay? So it hinge on the idea of a laissez-faire. Laissez-faire basically means government hands-off approach in the economy. Government should not touch the economy. The economy should be run by private sector activities, with less government intervention, no government intervention at all. And again, the source of productivity comes from the supply side of the economy. Production is going to be due to real shocks to the economy. But then Keynes said, no, let's think about this. When Keynes wrote his book in what he called the general theory of employment, interest, and money, to challenge this theory, the classical theory. So this book was written in 1936. The general theory of employment, interest, and money by John Maynard Keynes. It's explained that when prices are not perfectly flexible, deficiency and aggregate demand can generate recessions. Okay, so the classical economists had always told us that changes in aggregate demand had nothing to do with what? Real output. And you can see that here. Let me talk about this for a second, yeah, because this is so important. I feel like the author of your textbook doesn't do a good job. Kind of like, let me, okay, so in the classical theory, or the classical philosophy, okay, emphasizes real shocks as the main cause of fluctuations in real growth, real GDP growth. Meaning that what we talked about already, let me go back here. We talked about this here, so I see. The only thing that will affect GDP growth, real GDP growth, is when those real shocks we talked about, like wars, like technology, but not spending. Okay? So the assumption there is that let me go back here. So changes in demand, according to this classical theory, changes in demand, in aggregate demand, anything that shifts the aggregate demand curve, AD stands for aggregate demand, have no impact on real growth. That's what they believe in. Okay? So let me share with you what's going on here, what these economists are thinking here. Maybe somewhat not easy to delete. Okay, so you have something like this. So they're arguing that if we measure inflation on this axis, and we measure real growth on this axis, or real GDP growth. So we know that if this is my long-run aggregate supply curve, they believe that the economy is always producing on the long run. Okay. So this is the solo growth here. This point here. So if you have an aggregate demand here, let's say this is AD1. That's equilibrium is going to be here. So this is going to be your inflation pi 1. So suppose the Federal Reserve decide to increase the money supply. That will lead to more, or you get an increase in spending. Spending can come, remember, from increase in money supply or increase in velocity. What would happen is that, according to classical theory, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. See? To AD2. Does that have any impact? Because the new equilibrium is going to be where the new aggregate demand curve AD2 intersect with the long run aggregate supply curve. Does that have any impact on the solo growth or the real growth? No. The only thing that will be affected is that when you increase spending in the economy, or that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, you only cause inflation. But you have zero effect on what? On real growth in the economy. And then again, when you decrease the spending, see, you end up at this point. There's no change in real growth. The only thing that is affected is that inflation is going to fall to a lower level. So this is a philosophical view. So the classical theory that existed up to around the Great Depression, early in the 1930s, those economists believe that the economy is always operating in its long run at its full potential. So the classical theory does not recognize a short run. The Keynesian model that I'm going to be, the Keynesian theory that I'm going to be presenting to you shortly emphasizes that there's a short run. There are times when the economy is not going to be producing at its full potential. Sometimes a macroeconomy can produce below full potential, or it can produce above full potential. Okay, and again, to be precise with you guys, when we're talking about time horizon in macroeconomics here, when we're talking about short run and long run is not attached to a specific time frame. Long run in macroeconomics simply means the economy is producing at its full potential. Short run means anytime you deviate, you're not producing at your full potential, and you can produce less or more or above full potential. We say that you're in the short run. But classical theories they believe that the short run was not necessary because the economy is always hovering along its long run equilibrium. Do you know why Keynes wrote the book in 1936 to debunk this theory? These economists also believe that when the economy is producing always at full employment, the unemployment would be very low, unemployment would not go above 5%. If unemployment ever go up 5% and it's temporary, the labor market would adjust quickly, and we clear up that disequilibrium in the labor market so that nobody's unemployed. So you know what I mean? Those kind of stuff. Unemployment would be very temporary, and very low unemployment rate, exists in the economy, what we call natural rate of unemployment. Okay? That's what they believe in. Now, what happened was that the Great Depression happened in 1929 to 1933 when Herbert Hoover was president of the United States. That was the worst economic downturn in the history of the United States and the history of the world, perhaps. The unemployment in America peaked at 25%. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. And the Great Depression lasted for 43 months, nearly four years. So can you imagine? That means, translated, it means that if an American were to lose their job in 1929, 1930, it would take them nearly 4 years before they would get their next job. That's how painful the Great Depression was. Okay? So, because the classical theory that promised people that unemployment would never go above 5%, then people started questioning, why is it 25%? And it's lasting for a long time. In Europe, it was even worse. In the UK, the United Kingdom, unemployment peaked at 27.4% during the Great Depression. It's a lot worse in Europe than in the United States. To an extent that most European countries, politicians in Europe, they started not to believe in the free market, in capitalism. They thought the free market had failed them. Many had thought of they started thinking of a complete government takeover of the economies, like some kind of command and control economy, like communism or socialism, because they thought the free market had failed them. Then there comes Keynes. So Keynes wrote his book in 1936. to challenge the classical theory. Okay? So John Maynard Keynes explained that when prices are not perfectly flexible, deficiencies in aggregate demand can generate recession. So the Keynes believed that prices in the short run, prices may be sticky. Let me talk about it here. The classicals believe that prices of goods and prices of labor, like wages, are flexible. They adjust quickly to dissect. Anytime when you have a surplus in the market, prices tend to fall so that you go back to equilibrium. You have a shortage, prices rise. And so the classicals believe that these prices were flexible so that, the economies, you will not have a lot of surpluses and shortages in the markets. Markets would clear. But Keynes is arguing that John Maynard Keynes, when he wrote his book, he believed that prices may be sticky. Sticky means slow to adjust, less flexible, slow to adjust. And he gave several reasons which are true. One reason being, if you're thinking about labor price, the price of labor is wages. He argues that wages are sometimes fixed by contract. Employers and employees reach a labor contract, fixed by contracts. So when you sign a labor contract, your wages may not change for a while. So then preventing wages from adjusting. So wages may be sticky. And then he also argues that some prices of output sometimes may be prices of some goods in the economy may be sticky as well. Example includes menu pricing at restaurants. I'm going to explain catalog pricing, subscription to like broadband internet, subscription to like internet, those kind of. So he's saying, okay, most of the time, the owners of restaurants don't change prices on the menu every day. You know that. So Keynes, even if you own a restaurant in San Marcos, even though your cost may be going up every day, you're not going to be translating that to changing the price on the menu every day. First of all, it costs money to print new menus. Secondly, reason why restaurant owners sometimes are sluggish at changing price on the menu is that they fear losing their most loyal customers. If I come to your restaurant every week, maybe every weekend with my family, and I know dinner is $20 a plate, if I come next weekend and you're charging me $30 a plate, I may not come back. So that one of the reasons why menu pricing tend to be sticky, they don't change price on the menu frequently, even though the cost to the restaurant owners may be going up. Okay? It's because restaurants fear losing their loyal customers when they keep constantly changing pricing. Plus, it costs money to print new menus. So Keynes also put this together. So Keynes is arguing that the idea that prices are flexible is not true. Some prices in the economy may not be flexible. And when prices are not flexible, that prevents some markets from reaching equilibrium, including the labor market. Okay? That means unemployment could persist in the economy. Okay? So that means, so the Keynes then developed this, talks about the short run. So short run supply curve shows a positive correlation between the inflation rate and real growth during period when prices and wages are sticky, when prices don't adjust. Okay? Wages are even more sticky if you play professional sports. Let's say you play in the NBA, or you play in the National Hockey League, or you play in the MLS. You sign a contract. Okay, you can sign a 5-year contract. That means in 5 years, your wages are not changing because you're locked into that contract. So there's so many reasons to believe that wages may not change. Even ordinary Americans who don't play professional sports, who just work ordinary jobs, they reach some kind of contractual agreement with their employers that prevent their wages from rising all the time. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward slope, meaning that in the short run, according to Keynes, changes in aggregate demand can increase both inflation and growth rate. Remember, classical economists do not believe in the short run. In classical theory, we only have one supply curve. That's a long-run aggregate supply curve. The Keynesian model is a model of the short run, saying that there's a short-run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping. See this? When wages and prices are sticky. Keynes believed there's a long run. Classical believe there's only a long run. They don't believe in this short run. So that's a difference, the philosophical difference between Keynesian theory or Keynesian economics and what? And classical theory. So now think about it. So now, according to Keynes, if you increase aggregate demand, let's say the government spend more money, or the Federal Reserve increases what? Money supply growth, or the growth rate of velocity increases. We know that is going to shift the what? The aggregate demand curve to the what? To the right. Now you can see, according to Keynes, when aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, because Keynes is the one who believes in this upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, Keynesian framework, that means changes in demand can affect real growth. The GDP growth can go up to, say, 4%, and inflation may climb to, let's say, 3%. I'm just putting like a number here, you know. Meanwhile, for classical theory, because this curve that is upward sloping is not in the classical theory. Classical theory only believe in the long run. If you're in a classical theory, that means you'd be at this point here. There will be no changes in aggregate demand do not affect output because they only believe in the long run. Okay, it only causes inflation. Inflation would even be much higher when you increase aggregate spending in the economy. Maybe it might increase to 5%. But there will be no change in what? In real growth in a classical theory, because classical theory only not believe in that long run aggregate supply curve. I hope you're following. So now to go I want to talk about something here. So when we draw this line, let me draw another one. Open a new slide and draw something new. We are going to start talking about macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay. So we talk about, we call it the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So long-run macroeconomic equilibrium basically means that it's the point of intersection of when all these three curves are intersecting at one point. So we have our real growth here on this axis. And then we have inflation on this axis, pi. So when all the three curves, the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is abbreviated as LRAS, the aggregate demand curve, which is the AD curve, and now the short-run aggregate supply curve, which slopes upwards. This point where all these three curves intersect is what we call the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium point. Long-run macro equilibrium point. And this is going to be the general price level or inflation that exists in the economy. So this would be like just some kind of like a solo growth. Okay? But things sometimes may not work like that. So the classical theory, they always believe that the economy is producing on the long run. So now look at what Keynes is proposing. So Keynes is arguing that that is not true. The economy can produce below or above that long run. Sometimes the economy may produce less than normal output, what we call recession. Okay, so let me draw something here. So Keynes is arguing that there's a possibility you could have this case here. If we have inflation here, And you have your real growth here. This is scenario 1. So the intersection between aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply curve, see, may not happen on the long run. See the intersection between this short-run curve that slope upward and aggregate demand curve is happening to the left of this long-run aggregate supply curve. So if this is a solo growth output, is a solo growth, you know, then when you're producing, when the aggregate demand intersects short-run at this point, the economy is going to produce this what? This less. Growth is going to be below the solo growth. See that? So you're below solo growth. This is some kind of recession. Okay? So this point of intersection between aggregate demand curve and short-run aggregate supply curve is what we call short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. You can just call it macro equilibrium. So anytime the intersection between aggregate demand happens at and short-run aggregate supply curve happen at a point which is not on the long-run aggregate supply curve, we say that the economy is in short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. But sometimes the intersection between those two curves, the short-run and aggregate demand curve, could happen to the right of the long run. Okay, and by the way, this gap that exists when you're producing below the solo growth, this is what we're going to be calling a recessionary gap. The economy will be in a recession because you're producing below your normal output. Okay, but what about if the other way? It happens the other way. Sometimes the economy could also be overproducing when you are overly, maybe overexploiting your resources. You know, labor is working maybe overtime, those kind of stuff. So you have inflation, real growth. It's possible that the economy can produce beyond its full potential. So if this is your long-run aggregate supply curve, which correspond to this solo growth, the intersection between the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, see, this time is happening to the right of the what? Of the long run. In the previous case, was happening to the left. But this case, that intersection is happening to the right of this vertical line. So that means you're gonna produce beyond solo growth. And this is gonna be your inflation level. So this gap that exists when the amount by which now your growth rate exceed the solo growth is, you could call that gap an inflationary gap. So Keynes argues that economy can either produce an inflationary gap or we could be in recessionary gap, where we're producing less than normal output. Neither of those scenarios is pleasant. It calls for government intervention. So Keynes argues that when the economy is producing less than normal output, where the intersection between aggregate demand curve and short-run aggregate supply curve is intersecting before the long run, when you're in a recessionary gap, it means there's low aggregate demand. And so he calls for the role of government to boost this aggregate demand. How do we make the economy produce on the long run? How can we move the economy away from short-run equilibrium to its long run? So Keynes then is going to advocate for government policy like fiscal policy. Fiscal policy includes either more government spending or decrease in taxes. That would shift the what? This aggregate demand curve to the right, because it would increase spending growth in the economy. How do I speed up spending growth in the economy? You bail out Americans. You give Americans tax breaks, tax cuts. You spend more government money. Those are the only way that you can increase, because increasing spending will shift the aggregate demand curve. We talked about that. So then eventually the economy is going to move to a point where the new demand curve now intersect all the three curves at this point. That's what Keynes called for. And then when you're producing beyond full employment, that means the economy is over-exploiting. You need to slow down aggregate demand. How do you slow down demand? You increase taxes. Keynes proposed raising taxes. He proposes what? Decreasing government spending. Then this thing could shift to the what? To the left. If you are the Federal Reserve, you could decrease the money supply and raise interest rates because the Federal Reserve is in charge. We're going to talk about in the last chapter what the Federal Reserve controls money and interest rates. Congress controls taxes and government spending. The policies on taxes and spending is what we call fiscal policy. Policy on money supply and interest rate is what we call monetary policy. So monetary policy is controlled by the nation's central bank. In our case, the Federal Reserve controls the supply of dollars in the economy. If the Fed want to slow down spending in the economy, they're going to decrease the money supply growth. And in the last chapter, I'm going to show you the tools that the Federal Reserve uses to do that. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about, we talk about real shocks. So Keynes is going to argue that there are things that will affect the aggregate demand. Unexpected shocks. So anything that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left or to the right, okay, you can say anything which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left or right is called an aggregate demand shock. Example include things like increase in money supply growth, increase in see that? Increase in what? Oh, you have to say increase or decrease, because we're saying increase or decrease in what? In V, velocity. Consumer expectation, changes in consumer what? Consumer confidence, consumer and business confidence. You can say consumer and business confidence, or you can just say add business confidence there too, on its own. They could happen at the same time, though they could happen in isolation. Changes in consumers' wealth, household wealth. Taxes. Government spending. So those are some of the factors that will affect the demand curve, aggregate demand curve. So when the Fed decides to increase interest rates or decrease the growth rate of money supply, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. That's what they're going to call a negative demand shock. So let's talk about it here. So a positive shock to the demand to spending must increase either inflation or the real growth rate. In the short run, an increase in spending will be split between increases in inflation and increase in real growth. So Keynes is arguing that changes in aggregate demand will affect output in the short run. But in the long run, the real growth rate is equal to the solid rate, which is not influenced by inflation. So when the economy eventually is going to adjust back to the long run. I'm going to talk about how that happens. In the long run, therefore, an increase in spending will increase only the inflation rate. Okay, so let's give you guys an example here. Suppose there's an unexpected increase in money supply. The Federal Reserve decides to increase. So we're going to say that at the beginning, the economy was producing in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, which is point A. That's a point where every policymaker, be it Congress or the Federal Reserve, wants the macroeconomy to be. When all those three curves are intersecting, the long-run aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate demand all intersect at one point. So point A is a stable, long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where your inflation rate would be 2%, and the solid growth would be 3%. So see, all the three curves are intersecting. Economy is stable. And then let's say something happened. The Fed decided to unexpectedly increase the money supply growth. You know, when you increase the money supply growth, that's going to increase the spending growth. Spending growth increases, that means the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. See? So economy is no longer going to be at point A because it's a positive, that's what we call a positive demand shock. A positive demand shock is anything that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the what? To the right. So the economy moves to point B in the short run. So in the short run, see, as we move from point A to point B, see, real growth is going to increase from 3% to 6%. And then short run inflation is going to increase to what? From 2 to 4%. So the short run effect here is that you can document that anytime you have a positive demand shock. Short run effect is that real GDP growth increases and inflation increases. Why are we calling it short-run effects? Because at point B, that's the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Anytime the intersection between the short-run aggregate supply curve and the new aggregate demand curve, the red line, those two curves are intersecting at a point which is not on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So that is a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium that produces what we call an inflationary gap, because inflation goes up. Okay, but the economy is not going to remain there forever. Okay, what's going to adjust? So once we are at point B, the economy stays there temporarily. That's a short-run effect only. But in the long run, we're going to move to this point. I'm going to show you how. So when the economy is doing this well, workers are going to initially mistake a nominal wage increase for a real wage increase. Initially, you see that? That's the reason why they are going to increase production, real GDP growth. Because if they see their what? They see their whatever economy doing well, people are going to say, or they're going to see their nominal wages going up. But they have not, in the long run, they're going to realize that inflation also gone up. Inflation is also eating their pocket. Okay? So prices also don't move instantly because it is costly to change prices. So in the short run, Keynes argues that prices are not going to change immediately. So firms may also hold off on making price changes because they are not sure whether the change in market conditions is temporary or permanent. So as prices start to increase throughout the economy, workers demand even higher wages. You see, when inflation starts to rise in this economy, see that? Then workers are going to realize, oh, the cost of living has gone up. Let's demand even more wages. So as wages rise in the economy, the cost of producing goods are going to rise with it. Because wages is a price of labor. Wage is a price of labor. When wages are rising in the economy, that means the cost of production is going up. So companies, that's going to be like a negative supply shock. So the supply curve, the short-run supply curve, eventually, this curve is going to shift to the left eventually, and it's going to continue shifting until when the three curves intersect at this point. So we are back on it. So in the long run, we're going to adjust to point C. See that? And inflation is going to, I think I have a better diagram. And then, yeah, there you go. So, so we're going to adjust to point C. So when I ask you to, when we document the long run effects here, remember, we start from point A, and then the shock happened. We move, in the short run, we move to point B. In the long run, we're back to point C. Okay? So point C, we're going to say there's no long run effect. Long run effect on the solar growth rate. Because we are back to 3% where we were before. But inflation rises, see, to 7%. So the costs associated with changing the price of goods and services are called, we talked about that, menu costs. That's just testing your understanding. What about a decrease in demand? A decrease in demand is going to have the opposite effect. we're going to be what we call a negative. So anything that leads to a decrease in the growth rate of spending. For example, when consumers are losing wealth on Wall Street, when the stock market crashes, consumers feel less wealthy because they've lost wealth, they're going to reduce their spending. When the Federal Reserve slows down the growth rate of money supply, decreases the money supply growth. When the growth rate of velocity of money is decreasing, okay, things like that. Or consumer confidence goes down, business confidence goes down. All those are going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. That's going to cause a recessionary gap, okay? So here's what happens. So we're going to be, so your main task is always to begin at a point where the economy was stable. So we're going to, a point where all the three curves intersect, which is this point here, point A. See, that's a point where all the three curves intersect, where the short run, the long run, aggregate supply curve, and aggregate demand curve all meet. And then all of a sudden, the economy is hit by negative demand shock, like consumers cut spending because of lower confidence. Businesses are lowering spending because of low business confidence, or whatever. Federal Reserve decreasing the growth rate of money supply. So this shifts to the left. So in the short run, we're going to move from point A to point B. Okay? So you can see the economy is that's going to lead to, in the short run effect is that the economy is going to grow by -1%. Growth is going to fall from 3% to -1%. And then inflation is going to fall from 7% to 6%. There's a decrease in inflation. So a decrease in aggregate demand curve can induce a lengthy recession. So that's what we call a recession. A recession is when GDP growth is falling. That means high unemployment. So the amount by which the short-run growth is deviating from the solo growth, that would be the size of the recessionary gap. Okay? Now, when you ask me, what happens in a recession? Do economies stay in recession forever? The answer is, of course, no. So in a recession, what is going to happen is that wages are falling. Wages tend to fall in a recession. Nobody gets paid a higher wage when there's a recession, because in a recession, there's high unemployment. So many people are lining up for jobs. So the adjustment is that as wages start to fall when the economy is in a recession, the cost of producing goods becomes cheaper to companies. And that's going to be like a supply shock. So when companies find it cheaper to produce goods, that means the short-run aggregate supply curve, this line here, is going to start shifting to the right, because companies are going to start producing more and more output due to what? Lower cost of producing goods. When the cost of production goes down, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. You produce more output. So it's going to continue shifting until when you close that recessionary gap, when all the three curves, again, they're going to intersect at point C. So in the long run, as the economy adjusts to the long run, we adjust to point C, inflation even falls further. It might fall to like maybe 3%. I don't know what you define or whatever. But long run growth is restored. We are back to the solo growth rate of 3%. Okay? So this is exactly what you're saying here. So the economy kind of meanders around. We started at point A, and once the economy was hit by that shock, we moved to point B. So in the short run, when I ask you to document the short-run effect, the short-run effect is that inflation is going to fall from 7 to 6% when the demand curve shifts to the left. And real GDP growth is going to decrease from 3% to -1%. But in the long run, because we're in a recessionary gap, wages are going to start falling eventually. In the short run, wages are sticky. But in the long run, as economies start to adjust, wages start to fall, lowering the cost of production. So the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right to close that recessionary gap. So you're at point C. So are the same, so changes in the velocity, growth rate and velocity are the same as changes in the spending rate, holding money supply constant. That can be broken. So when you ask yourself, because growth rate in velocity is the rate at which the dollar changes hands. So you ask yourself, what are the factors that will drive spending in the economy? What will make the dollar change hands? Who are the people spending money? So spending, that changing can be broken down into consumer spending Business investment spending stands for I. It's like the equation for GDP that we talked about. Then government spending and net exports, net spending by foreigners. So changes in velocity, growth and velocity tend to be temporary. The shares of GDP devoted to consumption, consumer spending, business investment spending, government spending, and net foreign spending have been quite stable over time. Okay. Okay. So, for example, if consumers fear temporary decrease, when the consumers are fearing that something happened in the economy, maybe there's low consumer confidence, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. They can shift to point B temporarily. But wages are sticky in the short. That can put the economy temporarily in a recession at point B, and what inflation is going to fall. But in the long run, aggregate demand curve can return real GDP, real growth. You know, so we can shift the aggregate demand curve back. Okay, if we believe that consumers start to spend money on their own. Okay, or alternatively, if you are here, because the aggregate demand curve has shifted here, you could the short run supply curve economy could adjust depending on which one is triggered first. So this is a summary of things that shift the aggregate demand curve left or right. A faster growth rate in money supply, confidence in the economy, increased wealth, talk about it, lower taxes, greater growth of government spending, increased export, decreased import growth. So this will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Negative shocks to demand will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, the opposite of what I talked about here. I mean, consumers are having fears in the economy, slower growth rate of money supply by the Fed, reduced wealth because maybe stock market is falling, crashing, or housing market falling. Households feel like they're losing wealth. Higher taxes, lower growth of government spending, decreased export growth. Those are the things that will shift that. Yeah. And then here's your self-check. A slower growth in the money supply will decrease aggregate demand, of course, shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So the answer is A. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is basically a case study, the Great Depression. Kind of discuss briefly what caused the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 when Herbert Hoover was president. So the Great Depression was due temporarily to a large fall in aggregate demand. In 1929, the US stock market crashed. So when the stock market crashed, you know, Americans lost all their wealth, most of their wealth on Wall Street. Okay, that means they were not spending enough money. There was low confidence in the economy. So people felt poorer and decreased spending, reducing aggregate demand. So in 1930s, depositors lost confidence in their banks. Keep in mind that during the Great Depression, we did not have what we have today, the FDIC. You guys know what the FDIC is, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC was formed when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, became president in 1934, right? So FDR was signed the FDIC into law. So before 1934, meaning that during because the Great Depression happened from 1929 to 1933. If your bank were to fail or your bank were to go bankrupt, you lose all your money because all your deposits were not insured. There was no FDIC. So what does that mean? That means that if a bank were to fail during the Great Depression, even if that was not my bank, my interpretation would be that my bank was next to fail. And every American started to think that way. So they would start showing up at their bank location wanting to withdraw all their money before the bank would fail, because they were fearing that if the bank were to fail, they would lose all their money because their money was not FDIC insured. And in fact, let me tell you one thing. If we all show up at our bank location on a single day, all Americans show up wanting to withdraw all our money in a single day, all those banks you see in America will fail. Trust me. So because of that, nationwide bank panics, Americans had a run on their banks. The banks failed. So from 1930 to 1930, there were 4 waves of banking panics. By 1933, more than 40% of American banks had failed. That's how bad the Great Depression was. 40%. Close to 4,000 or 5,000 banks in America failed, by the way, during the Great Depression. So the fear and uncertainty also reduced investment spending. The U.S. capital stock was lower in 1940 than it had been in 1930 because investment is part of aggregate demand. So in 1931, instead of increasing the money supply, the Federal Reserve again allowed the money supply to contract. That is further shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left. All those are basically adding to the pain we talked about. Additional monetary contraction occurred even after the Great Depression from 1937 to 1938, prolonging the impact of the even though the Great Depression had ended in 1933, still there was some little bit of some effect of that Great Depression lingering, throughout the late 1930s. Okay, so during the early 30s, the U.S. money supply fell by about 1/3, about 33%, the largest negative shock to the aggregate demand in American history. This is how the aggregate demand curve shifted during the Great Depression. Just look at that. From the late 20s, look at it, kept shifting to the left. Consumer demand falling, investment demand falling, the Federal Reserve contracting money supply. So towards the end of Great Depression, around 1932, 1933, look at the money side. See, the inflation was, we had deflation, and the economy was growing at negative 13%, decreased by up to negative 13%. That's how bad that economic downturn was. But real shocks also played a role in the Great Depression, though. Bank failures not only reduced the money supply and spending, but also reduced the efficiency of financial intermediation. Economic policy mistakes also impeded recovery. Government agencies tried to increase prices by reducing supply. For example, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed into law in 1930, which raised the tariffs on imports. And then many European countries that America had imposed tariffs on goods coming from their country to America. They also retaliated by imposing similar tariffs on American companies that were exporting goods to Europe. So there was a big trade war that happened in 1930s due to that tariff. Okay, that was passed in Congress. It was called the Smoot-Hawley tariff because the bill was sponsored by two senators, Smoot and Mr. Hawley. Okay, so it was named after them. And then a severe drought and decades of ecologically unsustainable farming practice turned millions of acres of farmland into a dust bowl. Drought drove many farmers out of their farmland. The shocks compounded one another and made a desperate situation even worse. So that's the story about the Great Depression, which is basically like a small case study of how shocks in aggregate demand can cause what? A severe recession. So here are the takeaways of this chapter. Just a summary of it. Apparently, it's a fairly long chapter. So that concludes my discussion of this chapter. So I'm going to convert the recording of this chapter into a permanent YouTube link, which I will share at Canvas. And I'm going to be assigning like a short homework 7. This time I'll make sure that the number of questions that I write here are very few. Because I want you to also to prepare for other chapters as well for the final exam, which is on Sunday. So up to this point, there's only one last chapter that is remaining, which is a chapter on monetary policy. We're going to be talking about how the Federal Reserve controls the supply of dollars in the economy. Okay, how they control interest rates. So that chapter is the last chapter, which is chapter 35. I'll talk to you guys again next time when I cover that chapter. Thank you very much.